I knew my daughter-in-law wanted me gone the moment I found my wedding dress stuffed inside a garbage bag less than an hour after my husband's funeral. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask why. I just stood there in the rain and stared at 42 years of my life piled beside the garage like trash waiting for pickup. The strange thing was, part of me wasn't shocked. Not completely. Looking back now, I think grief had already been teaching me the truth in small pieces. I just hadn't been ready to see it. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. The rain had been falling steadily since noon. Not a thunderstorm. Just one of those gray Michigan rains that seem to settle into your bones. The funeral ended less than an hour earlier. Most of the guests had already gone home. The flowers were still fresh. The sympathy cards were still stacked in neat piles inside my purse. And my husband was still gone. That was the thought that followed me all the way home. Gone. The word didn't feel real yet. After 42 years of marriage, how could a person simply be gone? Frank had been in every corner of my life for so long that I couldn't imagine a day without him. Yet there I was, driving home alone. For the first time since 1982. I sat in my car for several seconds after pulling into the driveway. The windshield wipers moved back and forth slowly. The porch light glowed through the rain. Our house looked exactly the same. White siding. Green shutters. The porch swing Frank built during the summer of 1988. For a moment I almost convinced myself nothing had changed. Then I saw the garbage bags. 6 large black contractor bags lined up beside the garage. The kind people use during major renovations. I frowned. Frank had always wanted Daniel to clean the basement. Maybe he finally did it. Maybe Vanessa hired someone while we were at the funeral. I opened the car door. Cold rain immediately soaked my coat. My knees ached as I walked across the driveway. The closer I got, the stranger I felt. One of the bags wasn't tied properly. The wind pushed the opening wider. A sleeve slipped out. Blue wool. My blue wool coat. The one Frank bought me during our anniversary trip to Vermont 15 years earlier. I stopped walking. For a second I honestly thought I was mistaken. Then I saw the photograph frame. Then the brown leather purse. Then the pair of gardening gloves I kept hanging near the mudroom. My things. All of them. I reached down with trembling fingers and pulled the bag open farther. Inside was my life. Sweaters. Photo albums. Shoes. Scarves. Christmas decorations. And folded near the bottom was a white garment bag. I knew exactly what it contained before I touched it. My wedding dress. The dress I wore when I married Frank. The dress my mother had altered by hand because we couldn't afford a professional seamstress. The dress I had kept carefully protected for more than 4 decades. Now it sat crumpled between old shoes and discarded blankets. Rainwater dripped from my hair. I couldn't feel my hands anymore. The garage light suddenly clicked on. "Oh," a voice said. I turned slowly. Vanessa stood in the doorway holding a glass of wine. Still wearing the same black dress she'd worn to the funeral. She looked tired. But not heartbroken. Not devastated. Not the way a family member usually looks after burying someone they supposedly loved. She looked inconvenienced. "You got home earlier than I expected," she said.
Ich zerrte her.
"What is this?" She glanced at the bags. "Oh," as though she had forgotten they were there. "I packed up some of your things." "Some." I looked at the 6 bags. "My things." We needed space. The rain continued falling between us. Her voice remained calm. Practical. Almost cheerful. I figured it would be easier if we started reorganizing now. Reorganizing. Less than 4 hours after Frank's funeral. That was the word she chose. I waited. Maybe she would realize how cruel this looked. Maybe she'd apologize. Maybe grief had made everyone act strangely. Instead, she crossed her arms. "The house needs a fresh start, Helen." A fresh start. The words hit harder than I expected. As though my marriage had been a stain someone wanted removed. I swallowed. "What about Frank's things?" "We'll get to those later." "We'll." Not you. Not the family. "We'll." Vanessa and Daniel. A partnership. A team. A future that apparently no longer included me. Then she delivered the sentence that hurt the most. "Daniel agrees." I felt my stomach tighten. Daniel agrees. My son. My only child. The boy Frank and I raised in this house. The boy whose first bicycle still sat in the garage. The boy whose height measurements were still marked on the laundry room wall. I looked toward the front door. He's inside. Vanessa nodded. I didn't answer. I simply walked past her. The familiar scent of funeral lilies greeted me the moment I stepped inside. The kitchen counters were covered with aluminum trays from the reception. Half-eaten casseroles. Cookie platters. Paper cups. Evidence of sympathy. Evidence that people had cared enough to show up. At least for one afternoon. Daniel sat at the kitchen island. A glass of bourbon rested in front of him. His tie was gone. His sleeves were rolled up. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. When he finally looked at me, his eyes immediately dropped away again. That hurt almost as much as the garbage bags. Mom! His voice was barely above a whisper. I waited. I wanted an explanation. An excuse. Anything. Instead, he rubbed his forehead. We talked about this. My heart sank. There was no misunderstanding. No mistake. No confusión. This was planned. What exactly did you talk about? Daniel exhaled heavily. Vanessa appeared beside him. One hand settled gently on his shoulder. The gesture looked supportive. Protective. But something about it made me uneasy. Like she was guiding the conversation. Like she already knew what he would say. Just for a little while, Daniel said. Just until things settle down. What settles down? The house. The house. Not your grief. Not losing Dad. The house. I looked around my kitchen. My kitchen. The room where Frank and I drank coffee every morning. The room where Daniel did homework at the counter. The room where we celebrated birthdays and graduations and anniversaries. Suddenly it felt unfamiliar. We thought maybe it would be easier if you stayed downstairs. Downstairs. The basement. The guest room beside. The furnace. For a few seconds nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. Then I heard myself ask a question I never imagined asking. In my own house? Daniel closed his eyes. Vanessa answered instead. Nobody is throwing you out. That sentence always comes before someone throws you out. I know that now. Back then I still wanted to believe otherwise. We're just trying to move forward in a healthy way. Healthy. Another careful word. Wrapped around something ugly. I looked at Daniel. He finally met my eyes. For a moment I saw guilt there. Real guilt. Not cruelty. Not hatred. Just weakness. And somehow that hurt even more. Because cruelty belongs to strangers. Weakness belongs to family. Your father was buried today. The words came out softer than I intended. Daniel's face tightened. But he said nothing. Nothing at all. I nodded once. Then I turned toward the hallway. The hallway leading to the master bedroom Frank and I had shared for decades. Before I reached it, Vanessa spoke again. Actually, I stopped. We already moved some of your things downstairs. The sentence hung in the air. I understood immediately. The garbage bags. The basement room. The packed belongings. The conversation. This wasn't temporary. Not really. This wasn't about helping me grieve. This was about replacing me. Room by room. Object by object. Memory by memory. I walked down the basement stairs carrying only my purse. Neither of them followed. Neither of them offered comfort. The guest room looked exactly the way it always had. Small bed. Concrete walls. Tiny window near the ceiling. Laundry baskets stacked in one corner. I sat on the edge of the mattress. The silence felt enormous. For several minutes I simply stared at the floor. The funeral replayed itself inside my head. Frank's casket. The folded flag. The pastor's voice. Sophie crying quietly in the second row. Then another memory surfaced. A happier one. Frank sitting on the porch swing last summer. Laughing because I'd beaten him at cards again. You know something, Helen? He'd said. What? If I go first, you'll be fine. Y de lauga. Tough. Luck. You're stuck with me. He smiled. Promise me something anyway. What? Don't let anyone make you feel small. At the time I thought he was joking. Sitting there in that basement room I realized he hadn't been. Upstairs I heard footsteps. Then laughter. Vanessa's laughter. Soft. Relaxed. As though a difficult task had finally been completed. I lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. The house felt different already. Not because Frank was gone, though that pain was unbearable. No, it felt different because for the first time in 42 years, I no longer knew whether I belonged there. And deep down, a question had begun forming. One I wasn't ready to answer yet. Had Vanessa been waiting for this? Had she been waiting for Frank to die? The thought terrified me, because if the answer was yes, then losing my husband might not be the worst thing that happened to me that week. The first night in the basement felt longer than the 42 years I spent married. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it literally felt endless. Every hour stretched itself thin and refused to move. I slept in short fragments. 10 minutes here. 20 minutes there. Each time I drifted off, I forgot where I was. And each time I woke up, the truth returned all over again. Frank was gone. The master bedroom upstairs was no longer mine. And somehow, in less than a single day, I had become a guest in the home where I had spent most of my adult life. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of water moving through the pipes. For a moment I smiled. Frank always used the bathroom around that time. His knees bothered him during the last few years, and he rarely slept through the night. I almost turned toward his side of the bed, almost reached for him. Then I opened my eyes. Concrete wall. Low ceiling. Water heater. Reality. The smile disappeared. I lay there staring into the darkness. Grief is a strange thing. People think it arrives like a storm. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it comes quietly. Like someone slowly removing pieces of your life while you're still living inside it. By 6 o'clock I gave up trying to sleep. The basement smelled faintly of detergent and dust. A small strip of gray morning light filtered through the narrow window near the ceiling. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. My joints ached. My eyes burned. The room felt cold. Not physically. Emotionally. Like it belonged to nobody. Eventually I stood and opened one of the cardboard boxes Vanessa had placed beside the wall. Most of the contents had been thrown in carelessly. Sweaters tangled with old photographs. Kitchen towels mixed with books. A jewelry box resting upside down beneath winter scarves. I slowly lifted items out one at a time, trying to rescue some order from the chaos. Near the bottom I found one of Frank's old college sweatshirts. Navy blue. Faded at the cuffs. A small tear near one pocket. He refused to throw it away. Claimed it was still perfectly good. I held it against my face for a moment. It still smelled faintly like his aftershave. Not much. Just enough. The scent nearly broke me. I sat back down on the bed and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quiet tears sliding down tired cheeks. The kind nobody sees. The kind older women become very good at hiding. When I finally stopped crying, I pulled on the sweatshirt and headed upstairs. The house was silent. Daniel had probably already left for work. Vanessa usually woke early, but I couldn't hear her. For a brief moment, I hoped maybe yesterday had been some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe grief had made everyone behave strangely. Maybe today would feel different. The hope lasted less than 30 seconds. The moment I entered the kitchen, I knew something had changed. Again, I stopped near the doorway, confused. At first I couldn't identify what felt wrong. Then I realized it. My coffee station was gone. The small corner near the window where Frank and I prepared coffee every morning had been cleared completely. The basket of flavored creamers. Gone. The ceramic jar that held biscotti. Gone. The little framed photograph of Frank and me in Cape Cod. Gone. Even the coffee grinder had been moved. I stared at the empty space, trying to understand why such a small change hurt so much. Because it wasn't really about coffee. It was about memory, routine, home, the tiny rituals that make a life feel like your own. Morning. Vanessa's voice startled me. She sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone. A green smoothie rested beside her laptop. Her blonde hair was pulled into a neat ponytail. She looked refreshed. Rested. As though yesterday had been an ordinary day. Not the day we buried Frank. Morning, I replied. My voice sounded unfamiliar. Then somehow, I walked toward the cabinet where I kept my favorite mug. The blue ceramic one decorated with tiny cardinals. Frank bought it during a road trip through Tennessee almost 15 years earlier. Nothing expensive. Just a simple gift from a roadside shop. But it was mine. Or at least it had been. I opened the cabinet. The mug wasn't there. I checked another shelf. Nothing. Then another. Still nothing. Looking for something. I turned. Vanessa hadn't looked up from her phone. My mug. Oh. She shrugged. I boxed up some of the kitchen items. Some. There was that word again. Some. As though removing half of someone's life required a softer label. Why? We're trying to declutter. Declutter. Another careful word. Another word designed to make cruelty sound practical. I opened another cabinet. Half my dishes were gone. The floral plates Frank's mother passed down to me. The Thanksgiving serving platters. The casserole dishes I'd used for decades. In their place sat rows of identical white dishes. Perfectly stacked. Perfectly organized. Perfectly impersonal. My stomach tightened. You already packed all this? Vanessa finally looked up. Helen, you're not going to need most of it anymore.
Istert daher.
The sentence sounded harmless. Reasonable even. But something underneath it felt cold. Not going to need it anymore. As though my future had already been decided. As though my life had already been reduced. Before I could answer, footsteps sounded from the hallway. Daniel entered carrying his briefcase. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His tie hung slightly crooked. For a second, seeing him like that softened something inside me. He lost his father too. I couldn't forget that. No matter how angry I felt. Morning, Mom. Morning. His gaze drifted toward the cabinets. Toward the missing dishes. Toward the empty coffee station. Then quickly away again. He knew. Of course he knew. Nobody said anything. The silence stretched awkwardly between us. Finally Daniel cleared his throat. Vanessa thinks simplifying things might help everybody right now. Everybody. Interesting how everybody never seemed to include me. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. This was the same boy who used to build blanket forts in the living room. The same boy who cried when his goldfish died. The same boy who once saved his allowance for 3 months to buy me a Mother's Day necklace. Where had he gone? Or maybe the better question was, when had I stopped seeing who he really was? Vanessa slid a folder across the counter toward him. Don't forget your appointment at 2. Daniel immediately flipped it closed. Too late. I'd already seen the logo. A real estate company. My heartbeat quickened. What appointment? Neither answered immediately. The hesitation told me everything. Just some paperwork, Daniel said. What kind of paperwork? Nothing important. Nothing important. People rarely say that when something is actually unimportant. Vanessa took a sip of her smoothie. We're exploring options. Options for what? The property. The property. Not the house. Not home. The property. I felt suddenly invisible. Like I was standing outside my own life watching other people discuss it. Frank always called it home. No matter what. Even during difficult years. Even when money was tight. Even when repairs piled up. Home. One simple word. Yet somehow it meant everything. Property meant value. Home meant love. I looked out the kitchen window. The porch swing swayed gently in the morning breeze. Frank built it himself. I remembered him sanding the wood for hours. Refusing shortcuts. Refusing help. Something worth keeping should be built right, he'd said. At the time he was talking about the swing. Now I wondered if he'd been talking about family too. Daniel glanced at his watch. I should go. I nodded. Neither of us moved. There was so much we should have said. So many questions. So many hurts. Instead he picked up his briefcase. See you tonight, Mom. I watched him walk toward the garage. Halfway there he stopped. For one hopeful second I thought he might turn around. Thought he might apologize. Thought he might finally see what was happening. Instead he simply adjusted his jacket and kept walking. The garage door closed. The house fell silent again. Vanessa stood. Gathered her laptop. Finished her smoothie. I'll be out for a few hours. Then she paused. As though remembering something. Oh, and Helen? Yes. I think the basement arrangement is working much better for everyone. Everyone. Again. The front door closed behind her. I remained alone in the kitchen, standing beside the empty space where my coffee station used to be. Outside, a robin landed on the porch railing. Inside, the house felt strangely unfamiliar. Not because Frank was gone, though that wound was still raw. No, it felt unfamiliar because I was beginning to understand something painful. People often think betrayal starts with one terrible moment, one shocking act, one cruel sentence. But that's rarely true. Most betrayals happen slowly, quietly, one small disappearance at a time. A missing mug, packed box, an empty chair, a changed routine, a conversation held without you, until one day you wake up and realize someone has been removing you from your own life piece by piece. And the worst part? You don't know exactly when it started, only that by the time you notice, they're already halfway finished. By the third morning after Frank's funeral, I no longer recognized the rhythm of my own home. For 42 years, mornings had followed a familiar pattern. Frank would wake first. Always. No matter how late he went to bed. I'd hear the floorboards creak beneath his feet as he walked toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, the smell of coffee would drift upstairs. Then bacon. Or toast. Sometimes oatmeal when his doctor was watching his cholesterol. Nothing remarkable. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary life. The kind of life people rarely appreciate until it's gone. Now the mornings felt different. The house smelled like lemon-scented cleaning products. And expensive candles. Soft instrumental music played through speakers hidden somewhere downstairs. Vanessa's influence seemed to spread into every room, every corner, every routine, as though the house itself was slowly forgetting who had built it. I came upstairs shortly before noon. The basement had become unbearable. Not because it was uncomfortable, because it was lonely. Every object down there reminded me that I wasn't supposed to be there. I poured myself coffee into a plain white mug Vanessa had left behind. Tasted wrong. Coffee should never taste lonely. I carried it into the living room, then stopped. Completely stopped. The coffee nearly slipped from my hand. Frank's chair was gone. For several seconds, I simply stared at the empty space near the fireplace, unable to process what I was seeing. The chair had been there for nearly 20 years. Dark brown leather. Worn armrests. One loose spring that Frank always promised to fix. It wasn't just furniture. It was part of him. That chair had witnessed half our marriage. Football games. Christmas mornings. Family movie nights. Countless Sunday afternoons. It was where he sat reading history books, where he drank coffee, where he held my hand the night the oncologist explained there were no more treatments left to try. And now it was gone. Just gone. As though none of those memories mattered. I set my coffee down carefully. My hands had started shaking. Vanessa. My voice echoed through the house. A moment later she appeared from the dining room. Laptop tucked beneath one arm. Phone in her hand. Yes. I pointed toward the fireplace. Where is Frank's chair? She glanced at the empty space. Oh. Just oh. Like I was asking about an old lamp. I had it donated this morning. Donated. The word struck harder than I expected. You what? It was old, Helen. Old. Frank had been dead for 5 days. 5. I could still remember the warmth of his hand, the sound of his voice, the exact pattern of freckles on his shoulders. And somehow his chair had already become old. It didn't really fit the room anymore.
Esther daher.
The room. Not our room. Not Frank's room. The room. Neutral. Detached. Clinical. Though the life we'd built there had already been erased from the description. Before I could answer, the garage door opened. Daniel stepped inside carrying grocery bags. His eyes immediately moved between us, then toward the empty space. He knew. Of course he knew. You let her do this? The question came out before I could stop it. Daniel sighed. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. Mom. No. I shook my head. Don't do that. Do what? Don't say my name like I'm being unreasonable. His shoulders slumped. For a moment he looked 10 years older. We talked about it. Again. We talked about it. Always we. Never you. Never us. Just we. Vanessa and Daniel. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. The chair was falling apart. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because grief sometimes escapes in strange ways. Your father sat in that chair while he was dying. Silence. Neither answered. I looked at Daniel. Waiting. Praying. Hoping. Surely he understood that. Surely some part of him remembered. But instead he looked away. And that hurt more than the chair itself. Because the chair was furniture. Daniel was my son. Vanessa crossed her arms. We're simply making some updates. Updates. There was that word again. I had started to hate it. Updates. Declutter. Simplify. Fresh start. Every cruel thing dressed in polite language. Every wound wrapped in careful packaging. I turned away from them, unable to continue the conversation. The empty space beside the fireplace felt like a missing tooth. You couldn't stop noticing it. As I moved farther into the living room, another detail caught my attention. The reading lamp was gone too. The brass one Frank used every evening. The one I'd bought him for our 25th anniversary. In its place stood a decorative olive tree in a white ceramic planter. Beautiful. Modern. Completely meaningless. Then I noticed something else. The mantle. My stomach dropped. The photographs were missing. Not all photographs. Just ours. The pictures of Frank and me. The anniversary portrait from Cape Cod. Gone. The photo from Daniel's college graduation where Frank had his arm around my shoulders. Gone. The picture from our Alaska cruise. Gone. I crossed the room slowly, searching, looking for some explanation. Maybe they'd been moved. Maybe cleaned. Maybe no. Deep down I already knew. Where are our pictures? Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. I packed some away. Packed away. Like seasonal decorations. Like things no longer needed. Why? She sighed. Actually sighed. As though I were making her repeat something obvious. It's healthier not to dwell. Healthier. That word again. I wondered how many therapy articles she had read before deciding to dismantle my life. Healthier. As though remembering my husband was a medical condition. As though grief had become something embarrassing. Something inconvenient. Something to be managed. Not honored. Not respected. Managed. I looked around the room. Every remaining photograph now featured recent years. Daniel. Vanessa. Sophie. Family vacations. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. There was nothing wrong with those pictures. But together they told a different story. A rewritten story. One where Frank and I barely existed. One where Vanessa stood smiling at the center of almost every frame. For the first time I felt genuinely frightened. Not of Vanessa. Not even of losing the house. I was afraid of disappearing. Afraid that someday there would be no evidence I had ever lived there at all. The front door opened. Small footsteps crossed the hallway. Then a familiar voice. Grandma. I turned immediately. Sophie stood in the doorway holding her backpack. 14 years old. Tall for her age. Frank always said she inherited my eyes. The moment she saw me, her face softened. Unlike the adults in this house, Sophie still looked at me like I belonged. Sweetheart. She glanced around the room, then frowned. Where's Grandpa's chair? The question landed heavily in the silence. Children notice more than adults realize. Vanessa answered before I could. We donated it. Sophie's eyes widened. What? It was old. The same explanation. The same script. Sophie looked unconvinced. Grandpa loved that chair. Nobody responded. The silence itself became an answer. Sophie shifted her backpack nervously. Then her gaze moved toward the mantel. Toward the missing photographs. Where are all the pictures? Another silence. Another answer. I watched confusion spread across her face. Slowly. Painfully. Like she was beginning to see something she didn't want to understand. Before she could ask more questions, Vanessa stepped forward. Grandma's having a difficult time adjusting. Adjusting. I almost laughed. There was that word again. As though I'd accidentally checked into the wrong hotel. As though I weren't grieving the man I'd loved for 4 decades. Sophie looked at me. Not Vanessa. Me. And in that moment I realized something important. She didn't believe her mother. Not completely. I miss Grandpa too, she said quietly. The simple honesty nearly broke my heart. I pulled her into a hug. She smelled faintly like shampoo in school hallways. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Sometimes grief doesn't need words. Then she whispered something into my shoulder. So quietly I almost missed it. I don't like how everything keeps changing. Neither did I. But I couldn't tell her that. Children shouldn't have to carry adult burdens. So I simply squeezed her hand. It's okay, sweetheart. It wasn't okay. We both knew it. But sometimes love means protecting someone from a truth they're not ready to carry. After Sophie went upstairs, the house felt quieter than before. Not peaceful. Heavy. Like everyone was pretending not to notice a crack running through the center of the family. That evening, I sat alone on the basement bed. The cardboard boxes surrounded me. The sweatshirt smelled faintly like Frank. Above me, I could hear Vanessa moving furniture, dragging things across hardwood floors, rearranging, replacing, updating. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then a realization settled over me. Cold, clear, impossible to ignore. Vanessa wasn't trying to make the house feel different. She wasn't redecorating. She wasn't organizing. She wasn't helping anyone move forward. She was doing something much simpler and much crueler. She was removing evidence. Evidence that Frank and I had built a life there. Evidence that the house belonged to a family before she arrived. Evidence that I still mattered. Room by room. Object by object. Memory by memory. And for the first time since the funeral, I found myself wondering something I hadn't dared ask before. If she was working this hard to erase the past, what exactly was she trying to make room for? That Friday evening, Vanessa announced we were having a family dinner. She said it with the same cheerful tone people use when talking about holiday traditions. As though nothing unusual had happened. As though we hadn't buried Frank less than a week earlier. As though the house wasn't quietly being dismantled around me. A few people from church are stopping by, she said while arranging flowers in the dining room. Fresh white lilies. I stared at them for a moment. The scent immediately reminded me of the funeral. Everything seemed to remind me of the funeral. Even flowers. Especially flowers. Just something small, she added. I nodded. What else was there to do? Arguing with Vanessa never accomplished anything. She had perfected a certain kind of politeness. The kind that makes other people look unreasonable. If I protested, I became emotional. If I objected, I became difficult. If I cried, I became unstable. So lately I had learned to stay quiet, at least on the outside. Inside was another matter entirely. By 6 o'clock, the dining room looked like something from a magazine. Candles glowed softly. The silverware had been polished. The white dishes Vanessa loved were arranged perfectly. Everything appeared warm and welcoming. But I couldn't stop noticing what was missing. Frank's favorite serving bowl. Gone. The old wooden centerpiece we bought in Vermont. Gone. The framed family photo that normally sat on the buffet. Gone. Every familiar detail had disappeared. The room looked beautiful. And completely empty. The first guests arrived shortly afterward. 2 women from church. A retired dentist and his wife. Another couple I vaguely recognized from community events. Everyone offered condolences. Everyone spoke kindly. But I noticed something strange. Most of them addressed Vanessa first. Asked Vanessa how she was doing. Asked Vanessa how the family was adjusting. As though she had become the representative of the household. As though I were simply another guest. Daniel came home just before dinner. His tie hung loosely around his neck. His eyes looked tired again. The exhaustion never seemed to leave him anymore. Part of me wondered whether guilt was keeping him awake. Another part wondered whether he simply didn't want to think about any of this. Avoidance had always been Daniel's weakness. Even as a child. If a problem frightened him, he'd pretend it wasn't there. Unfortunately, adult problems don't disappear that way. Neither do grieving mothers. Dinner was announced around 7. Everyone began moving toward the dining room. I followed behind. Slowly. Carefully. The arthritis in my knees had been acting up all week. As we entered the room, something immediately felt wrong. I couldn't identify it at first. Then I saw the seating arrangement. My place wasn't at the table. Not exactly. There were 8 dining chairs surrounding the table. 8. Every seat occupied. Then, positioned slightly away from the table near one corner, stood a folding chair. A cheap metal folding chair. The kind people use during garage sales. For a moment, I honestly thought there had been some mistake. Maybe another guest was coming. Maybe then Vanessa smiled. There you are, Helen. Helen. Never Mom. Never anything warm. Just Helen. She pointed toward the folding chair. We set up a comfortable spot for you. Comfortable. I stared at the chair. Then at the table. Then back at the chair. Nobody said anything. Not the guests. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Nobody. The silence felt unbearable. One of the church ladies glanced down at her napkin. Clearly uncomfortable. The retired dentist suddenly became very interested in his water glass. Everyone noticed. Nobody spoke. That was the worst part. Humiliation rarely arrives with shouting. Most often it arrives through silence. Through things people refuse to acknowledge. I felt heat rise into my face. Not anger. Embarrassment. The kind that makes you feel visible and invisible at the same time. For one brief second, I considered returning to the basement. Eating alone. Avoiding the entire situation. Then I thought about Frank. About something he once told me after a difficult family gathering years ago. Don't leave your own table just because somebody wants your seat. So I smiled. A small smile. And sat down. The folding chair wobbled slightly beneath me. Nobody mentioned it. Conversation resumed. Artificially cheerful. Painfully normal. The weather. Local elections. Church fundraisers. Garden projects. Anything except the obvious. Anything except the widow sitting apart from everyone else. Halfway through dinner, I noticed another detail. The conversation kept returning to the house. Not directly. Indirectly. Subtly. Like people testing boundaries. This place has incredible potential, one guest remarked. Vanessa smiled. It really does. Potential. Not history. Not memories. Potential. The word bothered me. A little later someone complimented the kitchen. Vanessa practically glowed. We've been discussing a few updates. Updates. Again. The word seemed to follow me everywhere. What kind of updates? One woman asked. Vanessa exchanged a glance with Daniel. The glance lasted less than a second. But I saw it. We're exploring possibilities. I watched Daniel lower his eyes toward his plate. Not disagreement. Not support. Avoidance. Again. The same pattern. Always the same pattern. The conversation moved on. Then returned. Then drifted back again. Property values. Renovations. Market conditions. Interest rates. I felt increasingly disconnected. As though I were listening to strangers discuss a building. Not my home. Not Frank's home. A building. Finally, one of the guests asked a question. A simple question. The kind people ask without thinking. So what are your plans now, Helen? The room became quiet. Every fork stopped moving. Every conversation paused. I looked around the table. Waiting. Curious. Interested. Everyone wanted to know. What happens to the widow now? I swallowed. The truthful answer was simple. I had no idea. My husband was gone. My son barely spoke to me. My daughter-in-law treated me like an inconvenience. And I was sleeping beside a washing machine. I haven't decided yet. The answer felt smaller than the truth. Vanessa reached for her wine glass. We're helping her explore options. Helping. The word made me grip my fork tighter. What kind of options? Someone asked. Vanessa smiled politely. The house is a lot for one person. There it was. Not even disguised anymore. The maintenance alone can be overwhelming. I looked at Daniel. Still silent. Still avoiding eye contact. Still allowing someone else to speak about my future. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely disappointed in my son. Not angry. Disappointed. Anger burns hot. Disappointment settles deep. It stays. The conversation shifted again. But something had changed. Even the guests seemed uncomfortable now. They could feel it. Maybe not the entire story. But enough. Enough to sense something wasn't right. Dinner ended around 9. People gathered coats. exchanged hugs, promised to stay in touch. The usual rituals. As the last guests prepared to leave, one of the church women quietly approached me. Margaret, a widow herself. Her husband had passed several years earlier. She gently squeezed my hand. Nothing more. Just a squeeze. But her eyes lingered on the folding chair. Then on Vanessa. Then back to me. And in that brief look I saw recognition. She understood. Not the details. The feeling. The loneliness. The subtle ways people begin moving around a widow instead of with her. Call me sometime, she whispered. I nodded. I will. After everyone left, silence returned to the house. Daniel carried dishes into the kitchen. Vanessa began extinguishing candles. The dining room slowly emptied. I remained seated. Alone. Still on the folding chair. Eventually Sophie appeared at the doorway. She had been upstairs most of the evening finishing homework. Her eyes moved around the room, then settled on me. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. She hesitated. Children always know when adults are hurting. They may not understand why, but they know. Why weren't you sitting with everybody else? The question hit harder than anything that had happened all evening, because it came from innocence. Not cruelty, not manipulation, just honesty. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What could I say? That nobody thought to save me a place? That my daughter-in-law had quietly moved me outside the circle? That my own son had allowed it? Instead I smiled. A tired smile. There wasn't enough room. Sophie looked at the 8 chairs, then at the empty spaces around the room. She frowned. Even at 14 she knew that wasn't true. But she didn't argue. She simply walked over and hugged me. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then she whispered something that stayed with me long after she went upstairs. Grandpa would have hated this. The words followed me all the way back to the basement. Because she was right. Frank would have hated it. Not the chair itself. Not the seating arrangement. The message. The quiet exclusion. The slow erasure. Lying in bed later that night, I stared at the ceiling again. The house creaked softly around me. Above my head life continued. Doors opened. Water ran through pipes. Footsteps crossed floors. The sounds of a family. Yet somehow I had never felt more alone. And for the first time since the funeral, another thought entered my mind. One I immediately tried to push away. What if this wasn't grief? What if Vanessa wasn't simply insensitive? What if everything happening around me was intentional? The missing chair. The missing photographs. The basement room. The folding chair. The conversations about property. The future plans. The updates. The options. What if these weren't separate events? What if they were pieces of the same puzzle? And if they were, how long had this been happening without me noticing? The morning after the dinner, I woke with Sophie's words still echoing in my head. Grandpa would have hated this. She was right. Frank would have hated every second of it. Not because he cared about furniture. Not because he cared about photographs. Because he understood something many people never learn. The small humiliations hurt more than the large ones. A stranger can insult you once. Family can make you feel unwanted every day. I sat on the edge of the basement bed for a long time. The room felt colder than usual. Outside the tiny window, sunlight filtered through bare tree branches. The weather had finally cleared. The rain was gone. But the heaviness inside me remained. For nearly 42 years, whenever life became difficult, Frank and I faced it together. Now every decision belonged to me alone. That thought frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't afraid of being old. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of making the wrong choice while grieving. Afraid of misjudging people I loved. Afraid that grief itself was distorting everything. Maybe Vanessa wasn't trying to push me out. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the basement door opened. I looked up. Sophie stood there, still wearing her pajamas. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail. She held something in her arms. Can I come in? A smile touched my face for the first time that morning. Always. She stepped inside and sat beside me on the bed. Then she carefully placed the object in my lap. My blue cardinal mug. For a moment I simply stared at it. The tiny painted birds. The chipped handle. The faded glaze near the bottom. I felt my throat tighten immediately. Where did you find this? Sophie's expression became serious. It was in one of the boxes in the garage. I ran my fingers across the ceramic surface. The mug wasn't expensive. It wasn't valuable. But Frank had bought it for me during a road trip through Tennessee 15 years earlier. We'd stopped at a little roadside gift shop because he wanted homemade peach jam. He saw the mug and said the cardinals reminded him of the birds that nested near our porch every spring. The memory felt so vivid I could almost hear his voice. Grandma! I blinked.
I'm sorry, sweetheart.
She looked at the mug. Mom said it was clutter. The word landed heavily between us. Clutter. I wondered how many things in life became easier to throw away once they were reduced to a label. Old chair. Clutter. Photo albums. Clutter. Memories. Clutter. People. Clutter. Sophie hesitated, then lowered her voice. I don't think Grandpa's stuff should be disappearing. I studied her carefully. There was sadness in her eyes. But something else too. Confusion. Children depend on adults to explain the world. And lately the adults around her weren't making much sense. I reached for her hand. Neither do I. We sat quietly for a moment. Then she surprised me. Did you know Grandpa was worried? My heart skipped. Worried about what? Sophie looked toward the basement door, making sure nobody was listening. Then she answered. About the house. I felt completely still. When did he tell you that? Last summer. Last summer. Months before his diagnosis became serious. Months before the funeral. Months before any of this. What exactly did he say? She frowned slightly, trying to remember. We were fishing at the lake cottage. The lake cottage. Frank loved that place. Every summer we spent at least 2 weeks there. The cottage wasn't luxurious. Just a simple place overlooking the water. But Frank always called it his favorite spot on earth. He told me people change when they start thinking too much about what belongs to them.
Is er daher?
A chill moved through me. Did he mention anyone specifically? Sophie shook her head. No. Then she paused. Well, maybe. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? He said some people spend so much time planning for the future that they forget to appreciate the people standing right in front of them. I closed my eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like Frank. He never attacked people directly. He taught through observations, through quiet warnings, through stories. Sophie continued. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I should make sure you weren't alone. The room became very quiet. For a moment neither of us spoke. Because suddenly Frank felt close again. Not physically, but present. As though part of him still existed inside the people he loved. A voice echoed upstairs. Sophie. Vanessa. Sophie's shoulders stiffened immediately. The reaction didn't escape my notice. I should go. She stood. Then stopped at the doorway. Grandma. Yes. You know I love you, right? The tears came so suddenly I couldn't stop them. I smiled through them. I know. She disappeared upstairs. A few seconds later, I heard Vanessa asking about homework. Then normal household sounds resumed. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel completely alone. Not because Sophie could solve anything. She couldn't. She was 14. But because her presence reminded me of something important. Not everyone in the house wanted me erased. Not everyone had forgotten. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a walk. The basement had started feeling like a prison. The fresh air helped. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Children rode bicycles. Dogs barked behind fences. Leaves drifted across sidewalks. Life continued, indifferent to personal tragedy. As I passed the community church, a familiar voice called my name. Helen. I turned. Margaret, the widow from the dinner. She stood near the church entrance carrying a canvas grocery bag. Her silver hair moved gently in the breeze. How are you doing? The question sounded simple. But unlike most people, she actually waited for the answer. I almost said fine. Most widows learn that word quickly. Fine. A convenient lie. Instead, I surprised myself. I don't know. Margaret nodded, as though that was the most honest answer she'd heard all week. We ended up sitting together on a bench near the church garden for nearly an hour, talking, not about grief at first, about weather, about grandchildren, about gardening, the safe topics people use before they trust each other. Eventually the conversation shifted. Margaret studied me carefully. You're sleeping downstairs, aren't you?
Ich ster daher.
How did you know? A sad smile appeared. Because 20 years ago I slept in my own guest room for 6 months. I felt a knot form in my stomach. What happened? My husband died. She looked toward the garden. My son moved in to help. The way she said help reminded me of Vanessa. I thought we were supporting each other. She laughed softly, without humor. Then one day I realized everyone was making decisions except me. I listened quietly. People don't always mean to be cruel, she continued. Sometimes they simply become comfortable taking control. The sentence settled deep inside me, because it felt true. Daniel wasn't cruel. Weak perhaps. Avoidant. But not cruel. Vanessa was different. More deliberate. More ambitious. But even then, I wasn't sure whether she saw herself as the villain. Most people don't. Margaret touched my arm gently. Helen. Yes. Don't. Disappear. I frowned. What do you mean? She held my gaze. I mean exactly what I said. Her voice remained calm. Don't let grief convince you that your life ended with your husband's. The words hit harder than she probably realized. Because lately part of me had started believing exactly that. She continued. Your memories matter. Your opinions matter. You matter. Simple words. Nothing dramatic. Yet I felt tears burning behind my eyes again. Margaret wasn't giving me legal advice. She wasn't offering solutions. She was giving me something more valuable. Perspective. By the time we parted ways, the sun was beginning to set. I walked home slowly, thinking about everything she'd said. Thinking about Sophie. Thinking about Frank. Thinking about the strange feeling growing inside me. Not confidence. Not yet. Something smaller. The first tiny spark of resistance. When I reached the driveway, I immediately noticed something unusual. A black SUV sat parked outside the house. I didn't recognize it. The engine was off. But someone was inside, talking with Vanessa. As I approached, the passenger door opened. A man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Professional. Well-dressed. Real estate professional. My stomach tightened. The same logo I'd seen on Daniel's folder appeared on the side of the portfolio. The man shook Vanessa's hand, then turned toward the house. Toward my house. Toward Frank's house. Toward the place where nearly every important memory of my adult life existed. Vanessa smiled and pointed at the roofline, then the backyard, then the windows, the way people do during property evaluations. I stopped walking, frozen on the sidewalk. The man began taking notes, measuring, observing, assessing, and suddenly I understood something terrifying. The conversations about options, the comments about property, the renovations, the future plans. None of it had been casual. None of it had been theoretical. They weren't discussing possibilities anymore. They were making preparations. And for the first time since Frank's funeral, I found myself asking a question I could no longer avoid. What exactly had Daniel and Vanessa already planned for my future? And why hadn't anyone bothered to ask me? I stood across the street for nearly a minute, watching the man with the leather portfolio walk around my house. My house. The phrase still came naturally, even though lately everyone else seemed determined to call it something different. The property. The asset. The investment. Never home. Never the place where a young couple once painted a nursery at midnight because their first baby was arriving sooner than expected. Never the place where Christmas lights hung crooked because Frank insisted on doing them himself. Never the place where a little boy named Daniel raced through the hallway in superhero pajamas. Just property. I watched the man point toward the roof, then the garage, then the backyard fence. Vanessa nodded several times while writing notes on a clipboard. She looked energized, purposeful, more alive than she had looked during the funeral. The realization made me uncomfortable. I crossed the street slowly. Neither of them noticed me at first. The man was discussing square footage, recent market trends, Neighborhood values. The language of transactions. Not memories. Transactions. When they finally saw me approaching, Vanessa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The smallest reaction. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Helen. Her voice sounded overly cheerful. We were just talking. The man immediately extended his hand. Good afternoon, ma'am. I shook it politely. Good afternoon.
I'm Robert Myers.
Real estate agent. Of course. He looked professional. Friendly. The kind of man who probably sold beautiful houses to happy families every day. The kind of man who had no idea he was standing in the middle of a family crisis. What brings you here? I asked. Robert glanced toward Vanessa. A brief hesitation. Then professional caution settled across his features. Oh, we're just discussing market conditions. Market conditions. Interesting. Vanessa jumped in quickly. Nothing important. Nothing important. There it was again. The phrase people use when something is extremely important. I smiled politely. I see. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence felt awkward. Finally Robert checked his watch. I should be going. He handed Vanessa a folder. Then looked at me. My condolences for your loss. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Thank you. A moment later he climbed into the SUV and drove away, leaving Vanessa and me standing alone in the driveway. The folder remained tucked beneath her arm. I glanced toward it. She noticed, and immediately shifted it to the opposite side. Interesting. Very interesting. What exactly are you discussing? Vanessa sighed softly, as though I were asking an exhausting question. We're just gathering information. About selling the house? Her expression froze for half a second. Only half a second. But it was enough. I had my answer. Helen, nobody has made any decisions. Yet. She didn't say yet. But I heard it anyway. No decisions. Not yet. There it was. The missing word finally spoken aloud. I looked toward the house. The white shutters. The porch swing. The flower beds Frank maintained every spring. Not yet. Meaning eventually. Meaning someday. Meaning plans already existed. Vanessa followed my gaze. The house is very large. I said nothing. Maintenance costs are significant. Still nothing. And honestly. She paused, carefully choosing her next words. The market is very strong right now. I laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because suddenly everything felt painfully obvious. For weeks she had been talking about my grief, my emotional health, my adjustment. But eventually every conversation returned to the same place. The house. Always the house. The silence stretched between us. Finally I walked past her without another word. For once I wasn't interested in arguing. Arguments create noise. I needed clarity. Inside the kitchen I poured myself coffee. Again using one of Vanessa's white mugs. Again missing my cardinal mug. The kitchen felt strangely sterile. Like a model home. Beautiful. Empty. I carried the coffee downstairs. Then sat at the small folding table beside my bed. A cardboard box rested nearby. One of many. I opened it absent-mindedly. Inside were old photo albums. At first I thought Vanessa had simply packed them away. Then I looked closer. These weren't all. The albums. Only the older ones. The ones from before Daniel married Vanessa. Wedding photos. Camping trips. Anniversary vacations. Family reunions. Decades of life. A separate category. A separate pile. I slowly turned pages. There was Frank at 28. Standing beside the truck he loved. There was Daniel at 6 years old. Missing his front teeth. Holding a baseball glove bigger than his head. There was me. Young. Laughing. Standing beside a man who looked at me as though I were the most important person in the world. For a long time I simply sat there. Remembering. Then something caught my attention. A photograph slipped from between two pages. Picked it up. Lake Cottage. Summer. 3 years earlier. Frank sat beside Sophie on the dock, teaching her how to bait a fishing hook. The image brought an immediate smile. Frank loved that cottage. More than almost anywhere. Whenever life became complicated, he'd escape there for a few days. Fishing. reading, fixing things, thinking. My eyes drifted toward the back of the photograph. Frank often wrote dates on pictures. This one was different. There was a sentence, written in his handwriting. Simple. Short. If anything ever happens, make sure Helen keeps this place. I stared at the words. Once, twice, 3 times. My pulse quickened. Why would Frank write that? The cottage belonged to both of us. At least as far as I knew. Why leave a note? Why phrase it that way? A strange feeling settled into my chest. Not fear. Not exactly. Curiosity. The kind that arrives when small pieces stop fitting together. I turned the photograph over again, studied it, then placed it carefully beside me. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Vanessa remained busy upstairs. Phone calls, emails, conversations, movement, constant movement, like someone preparing for something. Around 4 o'clock, Daniel came home early. I heard his footsteps overhead. Then voices. Muffled. Tense. Arguing. Not shouting, but definitely arguing. I couldn't make out every word. Only fragments. Too soon. Needs to happen. We can't wait forever. Then silence. A door closed. Several minutes later, footsteps descended the basement. Stairs. Daniel appeared in the doorway. For a moment neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. More exhausted than usual. His eyes moved around the room. The bed. The boxes. The concrete walls. For the first time since the funeral, he actually seemed to see where I was living. Something flickered across his face. Shame. Maybe. I wanted to check on you. The sentence sounded awkward. Practiced. As though he'd rehearsed it upstairs. Infine. The lie came automatically. He nodded. Neither of us believed it. His eyes landed on the photo albums, then on the picture beside me, the one from the lake cottage. His expression changed instantly. Where'd you find that? The reaction surprised me. In the album. Daniel walked closer, took the photograph gently, studied it. For several seconds he looked almost like the boy I remembered. Not Vanessa's husband. Not a tired middle-aged man. My son. What? I asked quietly. He hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing. Nothing. Another family specialty. Nothing. Nobody tells the truth anymore. I pointed toward the photograph. You recognize it. Of course. His voice sounded distant. Dad loved that place. I watched him carefully. Is something wrong with the cottage? Immediately. Too immediately. His answer arrived. No. My suspicion grew. People tell the truth naturally. Lies require speed. Daniel handed the picture back. Then rubbed his forehead. A habit he'd developed recently. Usually when stressed. Usually when hiding something. Mom. Yes. He looked at me for a long time. Like he wanted to say something important. Something difficult. For one hopeful second I thought maybe he would. Instead, his shoulders sagged. Never mind. The hope disappeared. Just like that. He turned toward the stairs. Halfway up he stopped. Without looking back, he said something unexpected. Dad spent a lot of time preparing things before he got sick. Then he walked away. Frozen. Preparing things. Not handling things. Preparing things. The distinction mattered. I wasn't entirely sure why. But it did. That night, long after everyone else went to bed, I sat alone beneath the dim basement lamp. The photograph rested on the table. Beside me, Frank's handwritten note stared back. If anything ever happens, make sure Helen keeps this place. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Downstairs, my thoughts were not. Because for the first time since the funeral, I began wondering whether Frank had seen something I hadn't. Whether he had noticed changes long before I did. Whether all these strange pieces, the real estate agent, the house, the cottage, the missing photographs, the packed belongings, the basement room, were connected somehow. And if they were, then maybe I wasn't imagining things after all. Maybe the story hadn't started with Frank's funeral. Maybe it had started long before that. I just hadn't known where to look. The following Monday, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I had slept well. Because I hadn't slept much at all. The photograph from the lake cottage sat on the folding table beside my bed. Frank's handwriting seemed to follow me everywhere now. If anything ever happens, make sure Helen keeps this place. I must have read the sentence 20 times before finally turning off the lamp the night before. And still it refused to leave my thoughts. By 6:30 I gave up on sleep entirely. The basement felt smaller each day. The walls closer. The ceiling lower. The air heavier. I pulled on Frank's old sweatshirt and headed upstairs. The house was quiet. For once. No music. No phone calls. No sound of Vanessa typing on her laptop. I glanced toward the kitchen. Empty. Daniel and Vanessa had already left. Only silence remained. A rare gift. I poured myself coffee and carried it toward the garage. I wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because lately every place that still felt like home somehow belonged to Frank. And the workshop belonged to him more than anyone. The moment I opened the door, the familiar smell hit me. Sawdust. Motor oil. Old wood. Metal shavings. Coffee. Frank. For a second I simply stood there. Eyes closed. Breathing it in. Unlike the rest of the house, nothing had changed here. Not yet. His red toolbox still rested beneath the workbench. The old radio sat exactly where he left it. His reading glasses remained beside a stack of instruction manuals. Even his thermos still occupied its usual place on the shelf. The sight nearly brought tears to my eyes. It looked as though he might walk in at any moment, turn on the radio, complain about the weather, ask if I wanted coffee. I smiled sadly, then slowly began walking through the room, trailing my fingers across familiar surfaces. Every scratch had a story. Every stain carried a memory. I stopped near the workbench. Something immediately caught my attention. One of the lower drawers sat slightly open. Just barely. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Frank would have. Frank hated open drawers. It was one of those tiny habits developed over decades. Every drawer closed. Every tool returned. Everything in its place. I crouched beside it. Curiosity stirring. Inside were extension cords. Old manuals. Loose screws. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something hidden beneath them. A small metal box. Gray. Unremarkable. About the size of a shoebox. My heartbeat quickened immediately. I had never seen it before. Carefully I lifted it onto the workbench. The box wasn't locked, which somehow felt even stranger. Frank locked everything important. I stared at it for several seconds, then slowly opened the lid. Inside sat a thick envelope. Nothing else. Just one envelope. My name was written across the front. Helen. I stopped breathing. Not literally, but close. The sight of his handwriting affected me more than I expected. Because handwriting is intimate. A voice frozen on paper. Proof that someone once existed. Proof that they once thought of you. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. For a moment I couldn't open it. Part of me was afraid. Afraid of what it might contain. Afraid of what it might confirm. Finally, I slid one finger beneath the flap. Inside were several documents. A silver key. And a folded letter. The letter sat on top. Of course it did. Frank always understood what mattered most. I unfolded the paper carefully, then began reading. My sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I've already lost my argument with God. A laugh escaped me unexpectedly. A laugh tangled with tears. That sounded exactly like Frank. Even now, even from beyond the grave. I continued. If you're reading this, then I am gone. And if I'm right, Vanessa has probably started showing you who she really is. Everything inside me froze. I read the sentence again. Slower this time. Then again. Vanessa has probably started showing you who she really is. The words felt impossible, yet somehow perfectly familiar. As though they explained things I'd been unable to explain myself. My hands shook harder. I sat down heavily on the stool beside the workbench, then continued reading. I pray I'm wrong.
I trulido.
But I've watched certain patterns for several years now, and I know you, Helen. You always assume the best in people. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. It's also the reason I'm worried. Tears blurred the page. I wiped them away quickly, then kept going. Frank described conversations I never knew existed. Moments I never witnessed. Questions Vanessa had asked over the years. Questions about ownership. Questions about inheritance. Questions about the lake cottage. Questions about what would happen after his death. Nothing alarming by itself. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Yet together they painted a picture I didn't want to see. A picture Frank apparently saw clearly. Then I reached a paragraph that made my stomach drop. Daniel isn't a bad man. But weakness can be just as dangerous as greed when it refuses to stand up to it. I lowered the letter. Closed my eyes. Because deep down I already knew that was true. Daniel wasn't cruel. That would have been easier. Cruelty is simple. Weakness is complicated. Weakness makes excuses. Weakness avoids conflict. Weakness watches bad things happen and convinces itself there's nothing it can do. Frank understood that. Perhaps better than I did. I continued reading. 2 years earlier, after an argument involving the lake cottage, Frank had quietly met with an attorney. Not because anything had happened, because something felt wrong. The phrase appeared in the letter exactly that way. Something felt wrong. The sentence sent chills through me. Because lately I'd been feeling exactly the same thing. Then came the line that changed everything. The house is not entirely under Daniel's control, no matter what. Vanessa believes. I stared at the words, confused, then quickly looked through the documents attached to the letter. Legal paperwork, trust documents, property records, names, dates, signatures, pages and pages of information. Most of it made little sense immediately, but one thing was obvious. Frank had been preparing carefully, preparing quietly, preparing long before anyone knew he was dying. The silver key suddenly caught my attention. Picked it up. Small, heavy, old-fashioned, attached to a tag with a handwritten note. Safety deposit box. Downtown branch. More documents inside. My pulse raced. There was more. Much more. I looked back at the letter. The final page contained only a few lines. The shortest section. Yet somehow the most powerful. Helen, if none of my concerns turn out to be true, then burn this letter and laugh at me for being paranoid. I would love nothing more. But if they are true, don't let anyone convince you that grief makes you powerless. You built this life too. You belong here too. And no matter what happens next, remember something important. Being kind is not the same thing as surrendering. I couldn't stop crying after that. Not because of the trust. Not because of the documents. Because Frank knew me. Even now. Even after death. He understood exactly what I would do. Exactly what I would tolerate. Exactly how desperately I would try to keep peace. For a long time I simply sat there holding the letter. Listening to the silence. Then suddenly a sound echoed through the ceiling. The garage door. Someone was home. My heart jumped. Instinctively I gathered everything. The documents. The key. The letter. Seconds later, footsteps crossed the kitchen floor overhead. Then Vanessa's voice. Faint but unmistakable. She was on the phone. At first I couldn't make out the words. Then her voice drifted through the ceiling more clearly. Honestly, the sooner we settle everything, the better. My body went still. I listened. Helen is struggling emotionally. A pause. Then. Daniel agrees it may be time to discuss permanent arrangements.
Permanent arrangement.
The phrase landed like ice water. Not temporary. Not while I grieved.
Permanent.
I looked down at Frank's letter. Then at the trust documents. Then back toward the ceiling. For days I'd felt trapped. Powerless. Lost. As though the ground beneath me kept disappearing. For the first time since the funeral, that feeling began to change. Only slightly. Only enough to notice. But it changed. Because grief had left me many things. Pain. Loneliness. Fear. Yet sitting there in Frank's workshop, holding the letter he'd hidden from me, I realized something important. Frank hadn't left me helpless. He'd left me the truth. And sometimes the truth is the first thing a person needs before they can find the courage to stand again. Upstairs, Vanessa continued discussing my future, as though I were no longer part of the conversation. Downstairs, I carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I whispered something into the empty workshop. Something I hadn't said out loud since the funeral. Okay, Frank. My voice cracked. But now I need to know everything. And for the first time I wasn't just grieving. I was paying attention. After finding Frank's letter, I stopped reacting the way Vanessa expected me to. That was the first thing that changed. Not the house. Not the situation. Me. Before, every cruel comment felt like a fresh wound. Every missing photograph. Every packed box. Every conversation about options. They all landed directly in my chest. But now there was something different sitting beside the pain. Knowledge. Frank had seen something. Frank had prepared for something. Frank had worried for a reason. I still didn't know the entire truth. But I knew enough. Enough to stop doubting myself. Enough to stop wondering whether I was imagining things. Enough to start watching. And the more I watched, the more careless Vanessa became. 3 days after I found the letter, she invited several women from the neighborhood over for what she called a refresh gathering. The name alone made me tired. Refresh. As though the house had become a lifestyle project. As though grief could be redecorated. I heard the guests arrive shortly after noon. Laughter drifted through the floorboards. Wine glasses clinked. Music played softly. The house sounded more like a showroom than the place where my husband had died less than 2 weeks earlier. I sat downstairs with a cup of coffee and Frank's letter tucked safely beneath the mattress. Listening. Waiting. Around 1 o'clock, footsteps echoed above me. Then heavier sounds followed. Furniture moving. Voices giving directions. A few minutes later, curiosity finally got the better of me. I climbed the basement stairs quietly. The moment I entered the hallway, I nearly collided with 2 movers carrying a piece of furniture. I recognized it immediately. The antique sideboard Frank and I had bought during our 20th anniversary trip to Charleston. We'd spent almost an entire day searching antique stores before finding it. Frank loved telling people the story. How I'd argued over the price for 45 minutes. How the shop owner finally surrendered. How we barely fitted into the truck. Now 2 strangers were carrying it toward the front door. "Excuse me," I said. Both men stopped. One shifted his grip. "Mom. Where are you taking that?" The younger mover looked uncomfortable. He glanced toward the kitchen. The older one answered. "We were told it was being donated." Donated. Again. Everything was donated. Every piece of our history apparently belonged to someone else now. Before I could respond, Vanessa appeared. She wore white jeans and a beige sweater. Perfect makeup. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. She looked more like a real estate influencer than a grieving daughter-in-law. "Helen." Her tone remained cheerful. "You're upstairs." An odd thing to say. As though I'd wandered into a restricted area. I looked at the sideboard. Why is this leaving? We don't really have a place for it. We. Always we. Never me. Never us. Never family. Just we. The team. The decision makers. The future owners. I nodded slowly. To Vanessa's surprise.
No argument. No tears. No protest.
Just a nod. The reaction clearly unsettled her. I saw it immediately. She had expected resistance. Expected emotion. Expected conflict. Instead I simply smiled. "Whatever you think is best." For the first time since I'd known her, Vanessa looked genuinely confused. Only for a moment. Then the expression vanished. "Thank you for understanding." Understanding. Interesting choice of words. I watched the movers leave with the sideboard, then quietly returned downstairs. That afternoon, while folding laundry near the washing machine, I overheard voices drifting through the ceiling. The women had gathered in the kitchen. Wine. Cheese trays. Laughter. First I ignored it. Then I heard my name. And everything changed. "Helen seems to be handling things surprisingly well." One woman said it casually. "The way people discuss weather." I froze. A few seconds later Vanessa answered. "Oh, she's adjusting." Adjusting. There was that word again. I hated it now. The word had become a weapon. A polite way of describing someone else's loss. Another woman laughed softly. "I don't know how you do it. I could never live with my mother-in-law." More laughter followed. Then Vanessa spoke. The tone of her voice was different. Lower. More relaxed. The tone people use when they believe they're among allies. Honestly, somebody had to take control eventually. The sentence made my stomach tighten. I set down the towel in my hands, listening. Frank kept everything frozen in the past. Frozen in the past. I looked around the basement. The boxes. The photographs. The pieces of my life stacked against concrete walls. Another woman asked the question I've been waiting for. So what's happening with Helen? The room above me fell briefly quiet. Then Vanessa sighed dramatically, theatrically, as though carrying an enormous burden. Daniel and I are exploring options. Options. Again. Assisted living maybe. I stopped breathing. Not literally, but close. Assisted living. The words echoed through my head. Another woman sounded surprised. Already. Vanessa lowered her voice. But not enough. She can't really manage this house emotionally anymore. Emotionally. There was that word again. Everything came back to emotions. Not legal rights. Not ownership. Not family. My emotions. My grief. My supposed inability to cope. The perfect justification. The perfect narrative. The perfect excuse. Another guest spoke carefully. Has Helen talked about moving? Vanessa laughed. A small laugh. The kind people use when discussing someone unreasonable. Not exactly. The answer told me everything. No, I hadn't talked about moving, because nobody had asked. The conversation continued, and with every sentence I learned more. More than Vanessa ever intended. I think Frank babied her. That one stung. She never really handled the finances. Not true. She doesn't understand what things cost. Also not true. The women murmured sympathetically, as though Vanessa were caring for a difficult relative, not removing a widow from her own home. I leaned against the washing machine, suddenly exhausted, not because of what Vanessa said, because of how easily people believed it, how quickly a story becomes truth when repeated often enough. Eventually the gathering ended. Cars pulled away. The house quieted. Around 6 o'clock, footsteps descended the basement stairs. I looked up. Vanessa stood there holding a cardboard box. Thought you might want these. She placed it beside the bed, then left.
No explanación. No conversación.
Nothing. I waited until I heard her footsteps disappear before opening it. Inside were photo albums. Dozens of them. Wedding pictures. Christmas mornings. Family vacations. Daniel's childhood. My entire adult life. First I felt grateful. Then I noticed something. These weren't all the photo albums. Only the old ones. Only the ones from before Vanessa entered the family. I sat very still, looking at them, understanding. The realization arrived quietly, like most painful truths do. She wasn't organizing memories. She was separating them, creating two versions of the family. The old family, and the new one. The old family had been boxed up, stored away, moved downstairs. Just like me. I opened one album, then another, then another. Every page reminded me of a life that felt increasingly distant. Frank teaching Daniel to ride a bike. Family camping trips. Thanksgiving dinners. Anniversary celebrations.
A tousant ordinari moments.
The kind that become priceless only after they're gone. Hours passed without me noticing. Eventually I reached beneath the mattress and removed Frank's letter. Then I reread. A single sentence. Just one. Over and over. Do not let them convince you that you are powerless. I stared at the words. Thinking. Not angry. Not yet. Something else. Awake. For weeks I'd been reacting. Surviving. Enduring. Now I was beginning to see patterns. The missing furniture. The missing photographs. The conversations. The real estate agent. The assisted living comments. The story Vanessa was building. Piece by piece. Carefully. Deliberately. And for the first time I realized something important. Vanessa wasn't trying to force me out. Not immediately. That would have looked terrible. No. She was creating a narrative. A story. One where Helen was overwhelmed. Helen was fragile. Helen couldn't cope. Helen needed help. Helen should move somewhere smaller. Somewhere safer. Somewhere easier. Somewhere else. And the most dangerous part. She wasn't only trying to convince other people. She was trying to convince me. I closed the letter. switched off the lamp, and lay staring into the darkness. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa laughing while discussing paint colors for the master bedroom. The master bedroom. The room where Frank took his final breath. The room she already spoke about as though it belonged to her. I listened quietly, no longer grieving blindly, no longer doubting myself, no longer looking away. For the first time since Frank's funeral, I wasn't simply enduring what was happening. I was paying attention. And the more I paid attention, the more certain I became. Something much bigger was happening inside that house. And sooner or later, I was going to find out exactly what it was. 3 days later, I used the silver key. Not immediately. Not dramatically. For almost 70 years, I had handled uncertainty the same way. I waited. I observed. I thought things through. Frank used to joke that I could spend an hour deciding where to hang a picture frame. But this wasn't a picture frame. This was a door. And once I opened it, there would be no going back. That morning, Daniel left for work before sunrise. Vanessa headed to a fitness class. The house finally fell silent. I sat alone at the basement table with Frank's letter spread open beside my coffee. The silver key rested near the edge of the table. Small. Ordinary. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything else in the room. Picked it up. Turned it over in my palm. Then read the tag again. Safety deposit box. Downtown branch. For a long moment I simply stared at it. Part of me was afraid. Not of what I might find. Of what I might confirm. Because deep down, I still wanted to believe Frank had worried for nothing. I wanted to believe Vanessa was merely insensitive. I wanted to believe Daniel would eventually wake up. I wanted to believe families didn't unravel this way. But wanting something and believing it are not the same thing. By 10 o'clock, I was driving downtown. The bank sat on the same corner where it had stood for decades. Red brick. White columns. Large windows. Frank and I had opened our first joint account there shortly after we married. Back when we barely had enough money to keep $50 in savings. I smiled sadly remembering those days. We had been poor, but never uncertain about each other. Inside, the bank smelled exactly the way banks always smell. Paper. Coffee. Air conditioning. Quiet conversations. The manager recognized me immediately. Mrs. Whitmore. His expression softened. I'm very sorry about Frank. Thank you. The sympathy still felt strange. Like everyone was discussing someone who had simply stepped out of the room. Not someone who had vanished from my life. I handed him the paperwork from Frank's envelope. Then the silver key. He examined both carefully. His demeanor changed immediately. Not colder. More formal. More attentive. Would you mind coming with me? My heartbeat quickened. I followed him down a hallway toward a private office. A few minutes later, a metal box sat on the desk between us. Simple. Unremarkable. Yet my hands trembled. The manager gave me privacy, then quietly left. I was alone. Just me, the box, and whatever Frank had hidden inside. For several seconds I couldn't move. I simply stared at it, then slowly lifted the lid. My breath caught immediately. The box was full. Documents. Folders. Property records. Financial statements. Legal papers. Everything meticulously organized. Exactly the way Frank would have done it. On top sat another envelope. My name again. Helen. The sight nearly brought tears to my eyes. Even now, even after death, he was still taking care of things. I opened the letter first. Of course I did. Frank understood me too well. My sweetheart, if you've reached this box, then things are probably worse than I hoped. I laughed softly through tears. Trust Frank to begin with honesty. I continued reading. I know you. If everything were fine, you would have ignored this key forever. That was probably true. Very true. He knew I avoided conflict, avoided suspicion, avoided assuming the worst. The letter continued. Frank explained that after several uncomfortable conversations about inheritance and property, he had consulted an attorney. Not because anyone had done anything illegal, because he no longer trusted certain motivations. The distinction mattered. Frank wasn't accusing. He was observing. And Frank had always been an excellent observer. Then I reached the section that changed everything. Attached to the letter was a trust document. Several trust documents, actually. I spent nearly 20 minutes reading them, then another 10 minutes reading them again. Not because they were complicated, because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The house, our house, could not be sold, could not be refinanced, could not be transferred, without my written authorization. Mine. Not Daniel's. Not anyone else's. Mine. I stared at the page, then read it again, then again. Years of marriage had taught me something about Frank. When he made a decision, he made it carefully, deliberately, and apparently he had made this 1 year ago. My pulse raced. I kept reading. The lake cottage had also been placed inside the trust. Again under my lifetime authority. Again protected. Again requiring my consent. I sat back slowly, trying to absorb everything. Outside the office window, traffic moved through downtown as usual. People walked along sidewalks. Life continued. Yet inside that room, my entire understanding of the last 2 weeks shifted. Suddenly the real estate agent made sense. The conversations made sense. The urgency made sense. Vanessa believed something that wasn't true. She believed ownership automatically flowed through Daniel. But according to these documents, it didn't. Not even close. I reached for the second letter. The shorter one. The more personal one. The first sentence immediately stopped me. Helen, keeping peace with selfish people only teaches them how far they are allowed to go. I lowered the page, closed my eyes, and for the first time since the funeral I felt anger. Not explosive anger. Not rage. Something quieter. Something older. The anger of realizing someone has mistaken your kindness for weakness. The anger of realizing you've spent years giving people the benefit of the doubt while they quietly take advantage of it. Frank's words continued. He reminded me of all the times I'd chosen harmony over confrontation. All the times I'd apologized first. All the times I'd accepted less than I deserved because it seemed easier. Then came a sentence that hit especially hard. You've spent your life protecting other people's feelings. It may finally be time to protect your own. The tears came immediately, because it was true. Painfully true. I had spent decades smoothing things over. Keeping everyone comfortable. Keeping everyone together. Even now, after everything Vanessa had done, part of me still worried about upsetting her. The realization embarrassed me, and freed me at the same time. Nearly an hour passed before I finished reviewing everything. When the bank manager returned, he found me sitting quietly with the paper spread across the desk. Are you all right, Mrs. Whitmore? I looked up. For the first time in weeks I answered honestly. No. Then I smiled faintly. But I think I will be. He nodded, as though he understood. Maybe he did. After organizing the documents, I carefully placed them back into their folders. Not all of them. A few copies came home with me. Especially the trust paperwork. Especially the letters. Those weren't staying in a box anymore. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in days. I sat inside my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Thinking. Not celebrating. Not planning revenge. Just thinking. Because despite everything I'd learned, one important fact remained unchanged. Daniel was still my son. That complicated everything. If this had only been Vanessa, the situation would have been simpler. But Daniel knew enough. Maybe not everything, but enough. And that hurt. The drive home felt different. The same roads. The same neighborhoods. Yet somehow I no longer felt lost. The grief remained. The loneliness remained. Nothing about Frank's absence had changed. But something else had. The helplessness. For 2 weeks I'd felt like a woman being slowly erased. A woman trapped inside decisions other people were making. A woman waiting for permission to exist. Now I knew something they didn't. Something important. Something powerful. Frank had seen this coming. And he hadn't left me defenseless. When I turned into the driveway, 2 contractor trucks sat parked outside the house. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Workers carried flooring samples through the front door. Paint catalogs. Measuring tools. I stared for several seconds, then slowly stepped out of the car. Whatever was happening inside that house had already moved beyond conversations. And for the first time I was finally prepared to understand why. I sat in the driveway for almost a full minute before getting out of the car. The trust documents rested inside my handbag. Frank's letters were tucked safely between them. For the first time since the funeral, I carried something stronger than grief. I carried certainty. Not complete certainty. There were still questions. Still things I didn't understand. But one truth had become undeniable. I wasn't powerless. The realization felt strange. Almost unfamiliar. For weeks I'd been reacting. Surviving. Absorbing one humiliation after another. Now, for the first time, I possessed information. And information changes everything. The contractor trucks parked outside immediately caught my attention. 2 large vehicles. Both displaying logos from local renovation companies. Men moved in and out of the house carrying flooring samples. Paint boards. Measurement tools. One worker rolled a tape measure across the front porch. Another photographed the exterior siding. The sight made my stomach tighten. Not because I was surprised anymore. Because I finally understood what I was looking at. Plans. Not ideas. Not conversations. Plans. As I walked toward the front door, laughter drifted outside. Vanessa's laughter. Light. Relaxed. Confident. I hadn't heard that sound since before Frank got sick. The front door stood partially open. Nobody noticed me enter. The living room looked like a design studio. Catalogs covered the coffee table. Paint swatches rested on the sofa. Fabric samples were spread across the dining room. 3 contractors stood near the fireplace discussing measurements. And there was Vanessa, standing in the center of everything. Smiling. Gesturing. Directing. The way a homeowner might. For several seconds I simply watched. Nobody knew I was there. Which made them honest. One contractor pointed toward the staircase. If you remove this section of wall, the whole entryway opens up. Vanessa nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly what I've been thinking. Another pointed toward the 2nd floor. The primary suite has a lot of potential. Primary suite. Not master bedroom. Not Frank's room. Not the room where I spent 42 years sleeping beside my husband. A suite. Project. An opportunity. The language itself felt cold. Then Vanessa spoke. Once we modernize it, the entire house will feel completely different. Completely different. I thought about the photographs. The chair. The sideboard. The coffee station. Perhaps that had always been the goal. Not improvement. Replacement. The contractor smiled. How long have you owned the property? Before Vanessa could answer, another voice interrupted. His father owned it. Daniel. I hadn't noticed him standing near the kitchen island. His expression looked strained. Tired. He held a folder in one hand. The same real estate folder I'd seen before. The contractor nodded. Family homes always carry a lot of history. For a brief second, silence settled over the room. History. An interesting word. Because history was exactly what seemed to be disappearing. Then Vanessa slipped her arm through Daniel's. A casual gesture. Practiced. Possessive. We're taking over the property now that his father passed. The sentence landed like a stone. Not because it shocked me. Because she said it so naturally. So confidently. As though the future had already been decided. As though I no longer existed. The contractor smiled politely. Exciting. Exciting. I wondered what Frank would have thought about that word. His death had apparently become exciting. A new beginning. An opportunity. A renovation project. At that moment Daniel finally noticed me. His face changed instantly. The color drained from it. Mom. The room fell quiet. Every head turned. Vanessa's smile faltered briefly. Then returned. Helen. I nodded politely. No anger. No accusations. No scene. The old version of me would have reacted emotionally. The new version was learning something important. People reveal far more when they believe they've already won. I didn't realize we were having company. One contractor offered a polite greeting. The others followed. Nice men. Probably decent men. Men who had no idea they were standing in the middle of a family war. Vanessa recovered quickly. We're just gathering estimates. Of course they were. Gathering estimates. Just like they had been gathering information. Exploring options. Having conversations. Every major decision disguised as something temporary. One contractor looked toward me. Do you live here too, ma'am? The question hung in the air. Simple. Innocent. Yet suddenly nobody seemed eager to answer. I watched Vanessa carefully. The hesitation lasted less than a second. Then she smiled. The same smile she'd used for years. Pleasant. Controlled. Dangerous. She stays with us. Stays with us. Not lives here. Not owns part of the family history. Not built this home. Stays with us. Like a visitor. Like an elderly relative temporarily occupying space. Something cold moved through me. Not pain. Clarity. Because for the first time I heard the story exactly the way Vanessa told it. The story she shared with contractors. With neighbors. With friends. The story where I was no longer part of the foundation. Only an attachment. A responsibility. A guest. I smiled. The reaction clearly surprised her. That's one way to describe it. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. The contractors returned to their work. Measurements resumed. Discussions continued. But something had changed. At least for me. Because I no longer felt confused. No longer wondered whether I was imagining things. The mask had slipped. Just enough. As the workers moved upstairs, Daniel approached quietly. Mom. His voice sounded uneasy. I looked at him. Really looked at him. The exhaustion had deepened. The guilt too. For the first time I wondered whether he was trapped as well. Not trapped the way I was. Different. Trapped inside his own weakness. Inside years of avoiding conflict. Inside choices he no longer knew how to undo. How was your day? He asked. A ridiculous question. Yet somehow heartbreaking. Because it was easier than discussing reality. The bank was interesting. His expression changed immediately. A tiny reaction. Almost invisible. But there. Interesting. Very interesting. What bank? I held his gaze. The downtown branch. Silence. For one brief second, genuine concern crossed his face. Not fear. Concern. Then it disappeared. Replaced by caution. What were you doing there? The question came too quickly. Too carefully. I smiled faintly. Taking care of some things. The answer bothered him. I could see it. For the first time since the funeral, I had information he didn't possess. And neither of us acknowledged it. Vanessa called his name from the hallway. The moment shattered. Daniel stepped back. Excuse me. I watched him walk away. Still choosing distance. Still choosing silence. Still choosing the easier path. But something about his reaction lingered in my thoughts. He knew something. Not everything. But something. The contractors finally left around 5 o'clock. The house felt strangely empty afterward. As though a performance had ended. Vanessa remained upstairs reviewing catalogs. Daniel locked himself inside the study. And I returned to the basement. Not because I belonged there. Because I needed time to think. The trust documents sat beside me on the bed. Frank's letters rested on top. I read one particular sentence again. The same sentence I'd returned to. Several times already. Daniel isn't a bad man. But weakness can be just as dangerous as greed when it refuses to stand up to it. The words felt heavier now. Because I had witnessed that weakness all afternoon. The weakness to correct Vanessa. The weakness to tell the truth. The weakness to defend his mother. Weakness isn't dramatic. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It simply remains silent while someone else does the damage. Outside the small basement window, evening settled across the neighborhood. The sky darkened. Streetlights flickered on. And upstairs I could hear Vanessa discussing paint colors for the room where Frank had taken his final breath. I closed my eyes. For weeks, I'd felt like a widow being pushed toward the edge of her own life. Now something else was happening. The balance was shifting. Not publicly. Not visibly. But quietly. Because Vanessa believed she controlled the future. Daniel believed difficult conversations could be avoided. Neither of them knew what sat inside the folder beside my bed. Neither of them knew what Frank had prepared. And neither of them realized that every decision they made was carrying them closer to a truth they weren't prepared to hear. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't merely surviving the story. I was beginning to understand how it would end. The family meeting happened the following Thursday evening. For almost a week, I had known it was coming. Not because anyone told me directly, because Vanessa had spent days preparing for it. The house had never looked more polished. Fresh flowers covered the dining table. Candles burned throughout the kitchen. The countertops gleamed. Even the throw pillows had been replaced. Everything looked carefully staged, as though the house itself were preparing to testify. I sat downstairs on the edge of the bed, staring at Frank's letter. The envelope had become soft from being handled so often. I knew entire sections by heart now, especially the final pages. The pages that reminded me not to surrender my place in the life we'd built together. A knock sounded softly against the basement door frame. I looked up. Daniel stood there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep. The kind that comes from carrying something too long. Mom. His voice was quiet, careful. Mr. Calloway will be here soon. I folded the letter, slipped it carefully back into the envelope. I know. Daniel remained standing there, hands buried in his pockets, eyes avoiding mine, the same way they had been avoiding mine for weeks. Finally he spoke again. Vanessa thinks it would be best if everyone stays calm tonight. For the first time in days I almost smiled. Everyone. Such an interesting word. As though I had been the difficult one. As though I had spent the past 2 weeks removing furniture and discussing assisted living behind people's backs. I'll do my best, I replied. Daniel nodded, then hesitated. There was something he wanted to say. I could see it. Something important. Something honest. But just as quickly the moment disappeared. The familiar wall returned. He turned and walked away, leaving the sentence unfinished. Just like everything else. 10 minutes later I climbed the basement stairs. The house felt unnaturally quiet. The kind of silence that exists before storms. Vanessa stood near the dining table arranging glasses. She wore a navy dress. Elegant. Tasteful. And hanging from her ears were pearl earrings. My pearl earrings. The pair Frank gave me for our 30th wedding anniversary. I recognized them immediately. A small thing. Perhaps meaningless to someone else. But standing there, seeing her wear them tonight of all nights, felt symbolic somehow. Like a person trying on a role that didn't belong to her. She noticed me looking. Instinctively touched one earring. Then looked away. Interesting. The doorbell rang. Everyone froze. Daniel moved first. A few moments later, he returned accompanied by a tall man in his 60s carrying a leather briefcase. Silver hair. Calm eyes. Measured movements. Mr. Calloway. Frank's attorney. The man I'd met only twice before. The moment he saw me, his expression softened. Not with pity. With respect. Helen. He stepped forward and shook my hand. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. So am I. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he nodded, as though acknowledging something unspoken. Vanessa immediately stepped into hostess mode. We appreciate you coming. Professional smile. Professional voice. Professional performance. We really just want clarity moving forward. Clarity. The word almost made me laugh. For weeks she had been creating confusion. Now suddenly she wanted clarity. Mr. Calloway took a seat, placed the briefcase on the table, opened it carefully. The sound of the latches clicking open echoed through the room. Nobody spoke. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Not me. The silence itself felt heavy. Finally, Mr. Calloway removed several folders, adjusted his glasses, and began. Before his passing, Frank Whitmore established a family trust. Vanessa sat a little straighter. Daniel frowned. I remained silent. The attorney continued. The trust contains specific instructions regarding the family residence, the lake cottage, and several financial assets. I watched Vanessa closely. The moment the lake cottage was mentioned, her attention sharpened. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for me to notice. Mr. Calloway turned a page. Then read the sentence that changed everything. The primary residence remains under the sole lifetime authority of Helen Whitmore. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Vanessa laughed. A small nervous laugh. The kind people make when they think they've misunderstood.
I'm sorry.
She looked toward Daniel, then back toward the attorney. There must be some mistake. Mr. Calloway remained calm. There is no mistake. The smile disappeared from Vanessa's face. Completely. The house cannot be sold, transferred, refinanced or modified without Mrs. Whitmore's written authorization. The room felt suddenly smaller. Daniel stared at the attorney, then at me, then back at the attorney. Mom! The word barely escaped him. You knew about this. I held his gaze. Not triumphantly. Not angrily. Simply honestly. Your father wanted me protected. Daniel looked away first. The answer seemed to hit harder than the legal documents. Because suddenly this wasn't about property. It was about trust. And perhaps guilt. Vanessa recovered quickly. Too quickly. What exactly did Frank think Helen needed protection from? There it was. Not grief. Not confusion. Not sadness. Anger. For the first time since I'd met her, the polished mask cracked. Just slightly. Enough to reveal what sat beneath it. Mr. Calloway calmly removed another document. Frank included written concerns regarding future pressure surrounding property decisions. Daniel's face went pale. Pressure. The word hung in the air. Nobody missed its meaning. Nobody. The attorney continued. The lake cottage is protected under the same provisions. Vanessa's jaw tightened visibly. Again. A small reaction. Yet impossible to miss once you were looking for it. I thought about the photograph. The note on the back. If anything ever happens, make sure Helen keeps this place. Frank knew. Long before any of us. He knew. The attorney opened another folder. Then looked directly at me. Helen, Frank also left a personal statement to be read if these provisions ever became necessary. My throat tightened. A personal statement. Even now, part of me wasn't ready. Mr. Calloway unfolded a sheet of paper. Then began reading. The room became completely still. If you're hearing this, then my fears were not entirely misplaced. I closed my eyes. Frank's voice practically echoed through the words. I love my son. Daniel lowered his head immediately. I always will. A pause. Then. But loving someone doesn't mean ignoring their weaknesses. The words landed hard. Especially on Daniel. I could see it. His shoulders sagged. His eyes remained fixed on the table. Mr. Calloway continued. Helen spent her entire life putting this family before herself. My vision blurred. The attorney's voice softened. She deserves gratitude, respect, security, not charity, not permission, not tolerance, security. The distinction mattered. Then came the sentence that finally broke whatever remained inside Daniel. If my wife ever feels unwelcome inside her own home, then I have failed to protect her. Daniel covered his eyes. The gesture looked almost childlike. For the first time in weeks I saw something real. Not avoidance. Not denial. Pain. Actual pain. The kind that arrives when excuses stop working. Nobody spoke for several moments after the reading ended. The silence felt enormous. Finally Daniel looked at me. Really looked at me. Perhaps for the first time since the funeral. And when he did, I saw something devastating. Recognition. He finally understood. The basement room. The packed belongings. The missing photographs. The folding chair. The conversations. The real estate agent. All of it. Not as separate incidents. As a pattern. Pattern he had allowed. Vanessa was the first to speak. Her voice sounded strained now. Defensive. Nobody was trying to hurt anyone. The sentence echoed through the room. Weak. Insufficient. Too late. Because the truth about harm is simple. Intentions matter. But consequences matter too. I looked at her calmly. For the first time I didn't feel intimidated. Or angry. Or even afraid. I simply felt tired. You packed my wedding dress into a garbage bag the day we buried Frank. The room went silent again. Vanessa opened her mouth. Then closed it. No polished response arrived.
No clever explanation.
No therapy language. Nothing. Because some actions speak for themselves. Mr. Calloway quietly closed his briefcase. The meeting was over. Legally speaking. But emotionally, no. The real conversation had only just begun. And for the first time since Frank died, I wasn't the one sitting outside the circle. Someone else was. The house felt different after the meeting. Not peaceful. Not healed. Just honest. For weeks everyone had been performing. Pretending. Avoiding. Hiding behind careful words. Now the masks had cracks in them. And once a crack appears, it becomes very difficult to ignore. After Mr. Calloway left, nobody immediately moved. The dining room remained exactly as it had been during the reading. Half-empty water glasses. Cold coffee. Candles burning low. The flowers Vanessa arranged so carefully now seemed strangely out of place. Like decorations left behind after a party nobody wanted to attend. Daniel sat motionless, staring at the table. Vanessa stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. Neither spoke. Neither seemed to know what came next. For a long time, neither did I. Then I stood. Slowly. Quietly. The same way I'd stood after Frank's funeral. The same way I'd stood after finding my belongings in garbage bags. Only this time something was different. I wasn't standing because I felt defeated. I was standing because I was finished being invisible. I'm going upstairs. My voice sounded calm. Almost gentle. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed. I walked toward the staircase. Each step felt familiar. For the first time in weeks I wasn't climbing stairs as a guest. I was walking through my own home. When I reached the second floor, I paused outside the master bedroom. The door stood slightly open. I hadn't slept there since Frank's funeral. Hadn't even entered it. Partly because of grief. Partly because I knew Vanessa wanted the room. I slowly pushed the door open. The sight stole my breath. The room still looked like ours. Not completely. Changes had already begun. A few decorative items had disappeared. Some drawers had been rearranged. But the essentials remained. Our bed. The quilt my mother made. Frank's nightstand. The window overlooking the backyard. For a moment I simply stood there. Listening. Remembering. 42 years. 42 years of ordinary moments. People talk about marriage as though it's built from grand gestures. It isn't. It's built from Tuesday mornings. Coffee. Inside jokes. Shared worries. Quiet loyalty. Thousands of tiny moments that eventually become a life. I walked toward Frank's side of the bed. His reading Bible still rested on the nightstand. Beside it sat his glasses. Exactly where he'd left them. My hand trembled as I touched the frame. The grief returned immediately. Raw. Sharp. Unavoidable. Because no legal document could change the truth. Frank was still gone. The trust protected me. But it couldn't bring him back. I sat on the edge of the bed. And cried. Not because of Vanessa. Not because of Daniel. Not because of the house. Because I missed my husband. For the first time since the funeral I allowed myself to miss him completely.
No distractions.
No conflict.
No survival.
Just grief. Real grief. The kind that comes from loving someone deeply. Eventually the tears stopped. And when they did, I noticed something sitting beneath Frank's Bible. A folded note. My heart skipped. I carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Helen, if you're reading this while sitting on our bed, then I'm guessing you've finally stopped running from your own heart. A broken laugh escaped me. Trust Frank. Even now. Even after everything. The note continued. I know you. You'll spend too much time worrying about everyone else. You'll try to keep peace. You'll make excuses for people. You always do. I smiled sadly. Because it was true. Painfully true. Then came the final paragraph. The last words Frank would ever give me. The words that changed everything. Please remember something. The house was never the point. The cottage was never the point. The money was never the point. You were. The life we built was never about property. It was about dignity. Don't let anyone convince you that growing older means becoming less important. You are not a burden. You are not an obligation. You are my wife. And you deserve to take up space in this world. The tears returned. But differently this time. Not grief. Release. I sat there for a long time. Holding the note. Holding 42 years. Holding goodbye. Then I folded it carefully and placed it inside my pocket. When I finally went downstairs, Evening had settled across the house. Daniel sat alone in the kitchen. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Daniel stood. His eyes were red. Not dramatically. Just enough. Mom. The word sounded different now. Not automatic. Intentional. I sat across from him. The same kitchen table where he'd done homework. The same kitchen table where Frank taught him how to balance a checkbook. The same kitchen table where our family once felt simple. Daniel stared at his hands. I don't know how to fix this. Honest. Finally. Painfully honest. I nodded. Neither do I. Silence settled between us. Not hostile. Sud. A different kind of silence. The kind that exists after truth arrives. Daniel swallowed hard. I kept telling myself things weren't that bad. I listened. I thought Vanessa was helping. A pause. Then I thought maybe you were just grieving. Another pause. Longer this time. But I knew. His voice cracked. And suddenly I saw the little boy again. Not the grown man. The little boy. The one who hated disappointing people. I knew things were wrong. There it was. The truth. Not greed. Not hatred. Cowardice. Weakness. Exactly what Frank had warned about. Daniel looked at me. I'm sorry. I believed him. That was the difficult part. I believed him. The apology was real. The regret was real. The pain was real. But so was the damage. Some truths arrived too late. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just acknowledgement. Then I said something that surprised both of us. Being sorry and rebuilding trust aren't the same thing. Daniel nodded slowly. Tears filled his eyes. I know. And for the first time I believed that he actually did. A few minutes later Sophie came downstairs. She looked nervously between us. Then hurried straight into my arms. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of shampoo and laundry detergent. Childhood. Hope. Future. The things worth protecting. Are you okay, Grandma? I smiled. A real smile. The first one in weeks. I think I'm getting there. She hugged me harder. And somehow that felt like healing. Not complete healing. Just the beginning. Later that night I packed a suitcase. Not because I was leaving forever. Because I needed space. The lake cottage would be quiet this time of year. The water. The trees. The porch Frank loved. I needed to hear my own thoughts again. Needed to remember who I was before grief and conflict consumed everything. The next morning I loaded the car. The sky was pale blue. The air cool. Perfect Michigan weather. Daniel carried my suitcase without being asked. A small thing. But meaningful. Vanessa never came outside. Part of me expected her to. Part of me didn't. Before getting into the car, I turned toward the house one last time. The white siding. The porch swing. The windows. The memories. Everything looked exactly the same. And completely different. Because now I understood something I hadn't understood before. This story was never about inheritance. Never about real estate. Never about ownership. It was about value. Not the value of a house. The value of a person. The painful realization that some people only appreciate you when you're useful. And the even more important realization that their opinion does not define your worth. I thought about the women who might someday hear this story. Widows. Mothers. Grandmothers. People who spent decades sacrificing for family. People who sometimes forgot they mattered too. And if I could leave them with one lesson, it would be this. Love your family. Give generously. Forgive when you can. But never confuse love with disappearing. Never confuse kindness with surrender. And never allow anyone to convince you that age makes you less deserving of respect. Frank understood that. Eventually I did too. I climbed into the car, started the engine, and drove toward the lake. Toward healing. Toward whatever came next. The pain wasn't gone. Some wounds never fully disappear. My relationship with Daniel would take years to rebuild. Some parts of it might never recover completely. As for Vanessa, I no longer felt anger. Only clarity. And clarity is often more powerful than anger. The road stretched ahead beneath the morning sun. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't driving away from something. I was driving toward myself. And after weeks of being treated like a guest in my own life, that felt like the greatest victory of all.